Footsteps, the most natural sound in the world, something you commonly hear especially if you don't live alone. Though if you do and no one is around, those steps are the most terrifying noises one could ever hear. I have been plagued with the most dreadful sounds of footsteps walking towards me since I was a teen. It happens at night, when I'm tucked into bed, feeling the gravity of the world forcing my eyes shut. Footsteps seem to cautiously appear, the sound slowly creeping its way into my mind. I try my best to not sleep. I wish I could say I suffer from insomnia or some other sleep disorder, but unfortunately I don't. Instead, I drink endless amounts of coffee each night, not wanting to close my eyes. On average, I get about 2 hours of rest, and somehow I've been able to make that work. My friends think I've gone mad, but they don't hear what I hear, those monstrous steps. They start off from a distance, slight shuffling like the sounds a kid would make when not wanting to walk forward, just dragging their feet, but eventually the timid steps transitioned into a more profound one, ones with malevolence. The sound usually wakes me sometime in the middle of the night, but as soon as my eyes shoot open, there would be nothing. The once bewildering sounds that echoed with such dominance simply vanish. Originally, I didn't think much about it. I told my parents about the footsteps, and they shrugged it off, telling me it was part of my dreams, that sometimes dreams cross over into the real world. I was confused. I didn't know what they meant about the dream world colliding with our own, but I took their words to heart. The closer the ponderous steps would get, I would just remind myself it was all in my mind, that whoever was making those noises in the dream world couldn't hurt me here. The older I got, the more dreadful the steps became. I would tell myself I was too old to be scared of boogeymen, so I went on about my life to the best I could, not letting imaginary beast conquer my world. I wouldn't always hear the sounds. Sometimes I would go months without hearing anything, but I noticed the older I got, the more frequent the steps would become. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that the sounds would happen at least once a week, and now they're every night. I could feel the presence of something approaching me, their shadow-lengthy arms reaching out through the mist of darkness to grab me as I slumbered in the realm of the unconscious. I know what it wants, something I took when I was young. I'm from a small town, one you probably have never heard of. It's somewhere up north, a land of gray skies and dirt roads, though the small pond we call home blossoms each year around Christmas time. Our town center that was abandoned is now inundated with reefs and endless strings of garland, but more astonishing is the wonderment of our Christmas tree, a massive relic that holds the keys to the center of our universe, standing taller than our own town hall. The jovial display is created for the tourist, strangers coming to our home consuming all the resources only to leave an empty shell once the season is over, taking another year for my city to come back to life with the resurrection of holiday spirit. Smiles and laughter fill the streets as wealthy families take part in the festivities, drinking overpriced hot chocolate while paving our roads with their trash. My parents owned a small shop right in the heart of town, the Christmas tree shining, its marvelous glow through our store windows, giving us a glimpse into the spectacle of what tourists experienced when coming here. As one might have guessed, we were no different from the other town folk. We were not that well off, and I spent my winter breaks helping out at our store during the busy season. Here is where I got to see all the other children from out of town smiling with wonderment as their parents gifted them with almost every present they could ask for. I honestly grew to despise these families, seeing how gleeful they were while we struggled to keep the lights on. My father was always looking for quick-get-rich schemes, convinced that all he had to do was find the right scam. Because of this, he wasted away our entire life savings by the time I was 10. So our entire family's income depended on our little candle store that was left to my mother by her parents. It wasn't much, and throughout the year, most of the town wouldn't spend a dime on luxuries such as scented candles. But during the holiday season, the out-towners would come in the droves, all too excited to buy their little piece of our country life. To be honest, I hated it. The stench of candy cane and cinnamon plagued my nostrils for months after the season was over, and all I ever dreamt of was for our candles to melt away like some horrid scene you would see in some scary movie. By the time I was in middle school, I pleaded with my parents to not force me to work in the store. I was tired of all the out-of-town kids looking down on me. Their judgmental stares and snickering had me on edge. But I think even worse, I was tired of having a front-row view to that obnoxious, oversized tree. Well, it wasn't so much the tree itself. It was more of what was in front of it, an empty golden chair with red velvet cushions. It was Santa's chair. As long as I can remember, our tradition of having Santa visit the town center was always the same. The week before Christmas, the jolly old man would arrive and sit at his throne, inviting all the eager kids unto to his lap, each one filled with hopes of having their ideal present gifted to them on Christmas morning. When I was 7 years old, my parents stood me in line to meet the man that epitomized the jovial holiday. I remember being bewildered at how long the wait was. I could see all the other kids smiling, reveling in the premise of meeting the old man, all thinking that asking him for some gift would magically assure them of their dream. For my age, I knew I wasn't like the other kids. Most of them that stood in line weren't from my town. I knew asking some stranger for some gift was just as foolish as wishing for something when blowing out your birthday candles. Though, my parents thought the whole event would make me happy, or maybe they just needed time for themselves. Either way, they left me in line as they drifted away to finish some Christmas shopping, all while the adults dressed like elves kept a close eye on me. For whatever reason, I felt the strange sensation of trepidation slowly creeping its way into my small mind. The longer I waited, the more that feeling of dread only grew. I think it was the permeating sound of that laughter. Santa's laughter. The man would belch out the most agonizing chuckle any time a new kid would sit on his lap. I even covered my ears a few times trying to block out the abysmal noise, but when I did, the elves would walk over to me and forcefully pull my hands down. Honestly, by the time I was a few kids away, I pondered the idea of just slipping out of line and searching for my parents. But as soon as I worked up the courage to do so, it was my turn. One of the elves picked me up with a bit of despondency, but their actions quickly turned into one of urgency. Rushing me over then, plopping me down onto the old man's lap, his laughter teared into my eardrums like daggers. I tried not to make eye contact with the dreadful man, but to my dismay, he pulled my gaze towards his, our eyes clashing in the middle like shooting stars colliding into one another. It was disturbing. His once laughter faded, and all that remained was a stoic frown of indifference as I waited anxiously for him to speak. I could see how old the man was. His skin was thin as paper, and his ocean blue eyes sharper than the Atlantic itself. His breath inundated my face with its horrid stench as I practically gagged out from disgust. But before I could let out a subtle cough, the man spoke.
"You are not a good boy. You are naughty,"
he told me with a raspy voice, anger seeping out of his tongue as each syllable lashed me with its heavy tone. I just stared at him in bewilderment. I felt like crying, but no tears would accumulate, no whimpers could be manifested. Instead, I remained frozen. An astonishing snarl formed on his melted face as his pathetic, dirty gray beard scratched the top of my forehead. I don't know how long I was on Santa's lap. It could have been for hours. Time seemed to dissolve into an infinite void. The next memory I have is of my parents talking to me outside of the designated area that was guarded off as Santa's workshop, inquiring what I had asked for, their smiling faces completely clueless to what I had just experienced. Being a kid, I questioned my own memory, thinking that perhaps I had fallen asleep in line, never meeting the jolly old man, though. I could still hear his laughter simmer around the narrow streets of our town center, and it sent chills up my spine. I didn't bother answering my parents. I just told them that I wanted to go home. The grinding of my insides didn't allow me to say many words, but I think they could tell by my dead stare that it was time to leave. After that, I did my best not to let the bizarre encounter ruin my cheerful spirit. Back then, I rather enjoyed the ambience that the season brought, the snowflakes and eggnog, and especially my mother's pumpkin pie. Even though we were poor, I still received several gifts, usually some trinket that could be bought at the dollar store. But I didn't care. The thought of someone thinking of me filled my heart with joy. That Christmas morning was like the ones prior. I opened several presents. They were mainly small-scaled action figures, some knockoff superheroes that no one ever heard of. My parents enjoyed seeing me relish in the delight of new toys. The aftermath of shredded wrapping paper glistening in our dimly lit room was a clear indication that present time was over. I remember my parents walking away getting ready for our annual Christmas breakfast, telling me they would clean later. As they walked away, I noticed there was still one unopened gift hiding behind our tree. The wrapping was to perfection, a shiny silk red bow displayed in the center of the present. My heart accelerated with pure bliss, thinking I had discovered some secret my parents were hiding from me in hopes that I would find it by myself. I looked down at the note. My heart sank. It didn't say it was from Mom or Dad. Instead, it said from Santa. I stared at the handwritten label with disbelief. My parents knew I didn't believe in Santa. Why would they bother with the theatrics? I didn't contemplate on the enigma too long. I was all too eager to see what secrets the mystifying gift would supply. I shook the box a few times, trying to identify any recognizable sound, but heard nothing. The weight alone suggested that only air would be behind the walls of the box. I tore into the gift with wonderment, and for whatever reason a slight shiver ran across my body. Subtle memories of that dreadful Santa consumed my thoughts, and as I opened the mystery, I saw there was only a sealed envelope. I narrowed my eyes, confounded as to why my parents would put a note inside of a box. Either way, I proceeded to open the envelope, anticipating money being enclosed inside. But instead it was a simple note, one that didn't take long to read. "Naughty boy," was written boldly in red paint. Or at least I hoped it was red paint. I remember dropping the letter and running in search of my parents, tears cascading down my face. I told them about the note, that it was from Santa, but they looked at me as if I had gone insane, reminding me that Santa wasn't real, and to add to my lunacy, the letter was gone, as if the mountain of wrapping paper swallowed all evidence of my delusion. I even jumped into the pile like some seal jumping into water, doing my best to find it. But there was nothing. No proof of what I saw was real. The next year, my parents tried to stick me in that same line, and I argued to no end that I wanted nothing to do with it. I could see how perturbed they were, especially my father. That's when they told me if I wasn't going to act like a child during Christmas, then they were going to treat me like an adult, and that's when I was forced to help out at the store. That Christmas morning, another mysterious gift found its way burrowed underneath our tree, only presenting itself when I was alone. Like the year prior, it was a simple note, one that needed no clarification. Naughty boy. The incoming years soared right by, and every winter I would have a front row seat when it came to seeing that horrid man. He always took his throne each year with such hubris as he passed judgment to all the patiently waiting children. I continued receiving mystery gifts, or should I say notes, the message always the same. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was one of my stupid friends playing some lifelong prank on me. Knowing how we treated each other, the thought wasn't too outrageous. I was always befuddled of how our town was able to reserve the same Santa. I knew he wasn't from our community, and seeing how old he was, I assumed and hoped that he would pass. But as I entered my teen years, it quickly became evident that the geezer had some real fight in him. By the time I reached high school, the boogeyman that would sit in front of our store bothered me less, and my threatening letters seemed more comical than nefarious. As usual, the corpse of my lonely town sprung to life as the holiday rolled around. The walking zombies that I called my neighbors were now filled with hope, understanding that the next few months would supplement half their annual income. I, on the other hand, wasn't so keen. By this point, just like any other teenager, my thoughts were consumed by girls. And working in my parents' candle store wasn't on the top of my list at trying to attract one. I begged my parents to not have to work this particular year. I told them I would do all the house chores, that I would even re-shingle the roof, just anything to get out of working at the store. It wasn't that I was ashamed of my parents, but I was tired of seeing the kids from out of town look at me with such disdain. If it were any other time period, I could visualize them flicking me a penny as a tip. I couldn't stand the thought, especially because of her. Kimberly. She was from our neighboring city. Like me, she didn't come from money. But each year, her parents would drag her here to celebrate the holiday, stopping in to buy some small candles for caroling. The first time I had saw her, I must have been 10 years old, and right away, I was completely smitten. She was beautiful, a single dove in a sea of pigeons. I remember always blushing whenever her and her family would come in, and I did my best to hide behind the counter in hopes that my mother would attend to them, though my stealthy nature was left to be desired, and it was quite evident to her family that I was available. I tried my best to act as if the blood wasn't rushing to my face, and I remember Kimberly's parents asking if I was ill. All I could do was shake my head, reassuring them I was fine. But that's when it happened, when we locked eyes. Kimberly knew I was blushing because of her, and the largest smile formed on her angelic face. I would have floated away in that moment if it wasn't for her parents breaking my daydream, asking how much was the candle they were purchasing. Each year, I would see different versions of Kimberly, growing into the gracious woman she would eventually be, but behind the different outfits and hairstyles, I could always see her light, shining brighter than any star. But my attraction wasn't one-sided, and she too was all too excited to see me each year, albeit for mere minutes. Eventually, I worked up the courage to get her number, and it didn't take long for us to build a bond. I was beyond thrilled to see her for the holiday, but I knew I needed more time with her. This is why I told my parents I couldn't work in the store, but unfortunately, they told me this wasn't an option. Being the good kid I was, I complied and asked Kimberly if she could sneak out of their rental lodge when her and her parents came to town. That's when I would make time for her. She was quite understanding. This idea satisfied her, and we decided to meet at the town center. She wanted to meet by the tree. When the hour struck, I snuck out my back window, my heart racing 1,000,000 miles, all to indulge with the premise of being able to kiss my crush, something I've dreamed of for years. And if Santa were ever real, kissing Kimberly would have been at the top of my list of things I wanted for Christmas. The night felt different. The breeze prickled at my skin like small knives cutting deep gashes amongst my cheeks, and the thin air seemed to vacate my lungs for higher ground. Something was definitely off, and the only thing my teenage mind came up with was the fact I was meeting Kimberly. I told myself that it was just nerves. I've built up this moment far too long, and now I was psyching myself out. I didn't let my trepidation consume me. Instead, I pressed on with reassurance that Kimberly's soft, pouty lips awaited me on the other end of this dark, foreboding tunnel. When I arrived to the town square, I could see Kimberly's silhouette standing next to the Christmas tree. The monstrosity's oversized shadow encapsulated her in a vague darkness. Our town was quiet. I could hear the rustling of leaves brush against the pavement, swirls of debris colliding against park benches as the wind randomly guided them across our city. My fear did not subside by this point. In fact, it seemed to only strengthen. Kimberly?" I called out nervously. The shadow beneath the tree did nothing. No response or recognition of any type. Perhaps she had headphones on. I stepped closer as the thumping of my own heartbeat inundated my hearing, but soon that sound was replaced by one that was unnatural, a mechanical one, but it came almost in a rhythmic pulse, just as my heart. I stopped to get a better listen as I inhaled deeply, trying to ease my breathing. The sound was a bit more vivid. The pulsating noise escalated to a faster pace, becoming more frequent, and after what seemed like minutes, I realized what the odd sound was. It was the sound of bells. "Kimberly?" I called out once again, this time with a whimper as the shaky tone that found its way out of my mouth fell on deaf ears. The shadow that I presumed was Kim still did nothing. It stood there without a glitch. I contemplated in those few seconds if this was all wrong. Those sounds of bells began to approach closer as the strong wind kept swirling around me. I gulped with a heavy sigh and knew I was being silly. There was nothing to be concerned of. I waited for this moment far too long, and I needed to finally hold Kimberly in my arms. Before I could take another step, my phone chimed, it breaking my chilling reflection. I pulled out my flip phone and looked at the message, the words sending pricks of needles down my spine. It was from Kimberly. "Where the hell are you? I've been waiting for an hour," it read. It was a series of texts, all from her asking about my whereabouts. I stood perplexed of how this was even possible. The timestamp showed that she was here at this moment. Midnight. I flipped my phone closed and looked at the time on the small screen. It said it was 3 a.m. How in the hell is that possible? I left my house exactly at 11:30. It wouldn't have taken me more than 15 minutes to get downtown. I remained frozen with uncertainty of how this could even occur, but then, out of the corner of my eye, I finally saw that shadow move. Whoever was standing underneath the branches of the tree finally turned to look at me. I practically dropped my phone from the mere sight. It then started to walk towards me while those damn bells got louder. I didn't bother looking back. Running the fastest I could home, I quickly crawled in through my window and locked it shut. Staying up most of the night, I stared out my bedroom window, ready for that shadow to try and enter. But I really didn't know what I would have done if it had breached in. Luckily, that never happened. Instead, I woke up with the largest headache on the floor. A pile of my own sweat drenched my clothes. The next day, I shrugged off the bizarre encounter as nothing more than another prank done by my friends, and I laughed thinking that they indeed had got me good. Although that didn't explain the time lapse I had experienced, and no matter how much I scratched my head, nothing of reasonable explanation came to me other than I must have fallen into some weird trance, reminding me of that time I had memory loss after sitting on Santa's lap. Even though I was happy dismissing the strange event, Kimberly didn't forgive me. Her and her family came into the shop the next day to buy their usual candles. I dragged her to the side as her parents picked out which scent they wanted. It was clear that she was angry with me. Her beautiful face displayed a frown that I still found endearing. She had told me that she waited for almost an hour and said that I was playing some devilish prank on her. She told me she could hear me walking around the tree, jumping out of sight any time she tried catching a glimpse of the person. I told her it wasn't me, that I never made it to the tree while she was there, and I told her about my bewildering experience, but she didn't buy it. She told me that she never wanted to hear from me again, and to my dismay, she blocked my number. Seeing her push those few buttons and eliminating me from her phone was the most gut-wrenching devastation I've ever felt. No matter how much I pleaded with her to reconsider, she left me destroyed, walking back to her parents as if I no longer existed. That same day, the man that I've grown to despise took his seat at his throne. With my heart shattered, I didn't even bother looking out the window. Though as the day passed, I felt eyes on me, like someone was leering at me, that feeling you get when you think you're being followed. It wasn't until the cheering subsided that I had the chance to calculate where my sixth sense was picking up the threat. Of course, the gaze that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand were coming from him. Santa. When a child wasn't sitting on his lap, he would direct his mischievous stare towards me, the vicious snarl that frightened me as a kid, now more sinister than ever. I closed the blinds to the store, no longer wanting to see anyone. I wanted the world to disappear, or better yet, I wanted to melt away to oblivion just like our candles. Even with the blinds closed, I could still hear the man's dreadful laughter, him belching out that phony chuckle almost every minute. I took out my phone and looked at Kimberly's phone number, and I could feel tears form on the corner of my eyelids. It had only been hours, but it felt like she had been out of my life for years. I closed the store down early and told my parents that I just didn't feel well. Which was the truth. My heartache was beyond any illness. The rest of the week, I had hoped that Kimberly would change her mind. I dreamt that any moment that she would walk into the store, smiling, showering me in her light, but that never happened. Instead, Santa's laughter would haunt my thoughts. Days passed, and Christmas was soon approaching. Kimberly would be leaving home after the holiday, and the thought left me empty, though Santa too would be leaving, which brought a bit of smile to my sad face. I knew if I was ever going to get Kim to forgive me, I had to get her a gift, one that would represent how much she meant to me, and I pondered throughout the day of what that could be. As the sun set, our town's Christmas lights sprung to life, the light intruding through our store windows, and that's when the idea came to me. My eyes followed the shimmering hues to its source, most of it coming from our Christmas tree, and as my eyes crawled upward, they finally came to rest on top of the tree, the star that shined above. I was going to steal our own star from on top of the tree, it being a symbol of pure light as Kimberly's smile was to me. I knew the gesture would be taken and our relationship restored to what it once was. It was Christmas Eve. The festivities that were celebrated in our town square slowly died down as everyone retreated back to their homes and rental lodges. I stood in our candle shop waiting for silence to overwhelm our city streets. I told my parents I would lock up and do inventory that night, something they were surprised of me volunteering for. The ruse would be simple. I would wait for everyone to be gone, and then I would climb that monstrosity and steal the star from up top. I waited for the clock to strike midnight. I exited our store, looking up at how tall I would have to climb, and the sight almost caused me to change my mind, but I knew I had no other choice. I needed to do this for her. Before locking the door, I remembered that horrid shadow that I had seen before and grabbed a few candles in hopes of illuminating my path underneath. I lit several of the candles and placed them at the base of the tree. I inhaled deeply, strapping my backpack around me, and looked up at all the branches. I then began to climb. I slithered between branches while the occasional colossal ornament hit me, the bristles from the tree branches cutting my cheeks as I climbed higher. The smell of real pine invaded my nostrils. I surprisingly found it to be calming, better than any scent could ever make in our cheap candles. Eventually, I made it to the top. I dare not to look down, knowing the height would scare me to the point I might lose my balance. I grabbed out to the star, it shining its glare directly to me. I pulled it off the tree and disconnected the power cable. To my astonishment, the darn thing still illuminated. I then placed it in my bag, hoping the light wouldn't be so bright that someone could clearly tell I had it. Perched on top of the tree, I took a moment to enjoy the view. I looked over our small town. With the streets covered in white snow, it really did look like something out of a Ron Oliver film. The subtle breeze soothed my scratched face as it cautiously rocked me back and forth on the branch I was sitting on. In that moment, I processed the realization of how outlandish this endeavor was. I knew some silly gift would not change Kimberly's mind, or even worse, she might think of me as some criminal. I shook my head, disappointed in myself, and pulled my pack in front of me, ready to put the star back to its rightful place. But before I could, the tree began to move violently. At first, I thought it was an earthquake, just from the sheer force. I grabbed onto the trunk of the tree tightly, as I could feel my legs loosing their grasp. I looked around, trying to figure out what was happening, and that's when I heard it. The sound that has terrified me since I was a child. It was Santa's laughter. I carefully peeked my head over, trying to get a glimpse through the branches, and sure enough, there he was, at the base of the tree, shaking the trunk as he laughed uncontrollably. He then raised his gaze towards mine. I retreated my head back into the branches and contemplated what I could do. I couldn't climb down. He was waiting for me down there. But the more I hesitated, the more violently he shook the tree. "I'll put it back!" I yelled out, but got no response. Instead, he had stopped. The world returned to normal as the wind continued rattling the leaves, but then the shaking returned, but this time in bursts. It would shake, then stop, only to shake again a few seconds later. The laughter also returned, and that's when I realized it was him climbing up the tree. I brushed away several of the branches, getting clear view of his menacing frown, a look of pure evil garnished across his elderly face, and the madness that display rage in his eyes shimmered in the moonlight.
"Naughty boy,"
he said to me while showcasing his horrifying grin. He seemed to be climbing with ease, almost natural to his biology. I remained petrified, still unsure of what I should do. He was closing the distance. I could almost smell his repulsive breath, and the stench sprung my mind into action. I knew I had to climb down the tree on the opposite side. I jumped down several branches at a time, making sure to leap at angles. I knew if I was going to get out of this alive, I needed to stay vigilant and not let my fear stop me. Eventually, we were at the same level but on opposite ends, and his egregious hand reached out, grabbing mine.
Naughty boy,
he once again screeched out. He began belching his all-too-familiar chuckle as I shook and squirmed, trying to release his tight grip. I began to sob, begging him to let go, that I was sorry for taking the star. By some miracle, I was able to break free, but at a heavy cost, because I lost my balance and fell to the ground from 20 feet above. I crashed through branches, which gratefully slowed my fall, eventually hitting the floor with a heavy thud. I gasped out with all of my breath as my lungs felt collapsed. My vision was blurry, but I didn't waste time, and I got up and tried my best to run. I could see our store, and I still had the keys I just needed to make it inside and lock myself in until daybreak. My hands reached into my pocket, fumbling around for the key. Hearing laughter flowing into my ears, I knew he was in pursuit and quickly dived into our store once I had opened the door. As I turned to lock it, I saw the most devastating sight. The candles I had left at the base of the tree were knocked over. Because now the tree had caught on fire, the embers overwhelming the pine needles and ornaments. It didn't take long for the flames to reach to the sky, and as I looked up through the window, there he was. Still belching out his horrid chuckle, he remained unmoved, the flames tearing into his flesh as his withered face began to melt.
naughty boy,
he still murmured out. I looked on with disbelief, all too horrified to even call for the fire department. Soon the amber glows engulfed the tree, and it tilted over, falling hard to the ground, like some axeman cutting down a tree in the woods. It landed on one of our neighboring stores, and soon it too was on fire. Still shook, I stood there watching our entire town square melt away like one of our candles, and by some grace of God, our store was the only one that was left untouched. Eventually, the fire department showed up only to vanquish the few remaining flames, but virtually everything was a mere shadow of its former glory. The next morning, as one could have guessed, a town meeting was formed. Out-of-towners and members of our community wept and mourned the loss of our town center. Christmas was ruined, but worse, our city never recovered. No one came back to our town. No use for a former Christmas wonderland, and most businesses closed down, including our candle store. I waited for the police to contact me, for them to tell me they knew I was there, that they found the body, but to my befuddlement, that phone call never happened. It was never reported that they found a body, or that it was because of our candles. They blamed the wiring. They said that the star got unplugged and energized the tree. I still had the star stuffed away in my backpack, and I kept it with me for years, not wanting anyone to know that it was me. I don't even know what happened to Kimberly other than the photos that she would post on her social media accounts. I'm still enchanted by her smile. And I now know what the footsteps are. I know who they're from, and I used to think it was just my guilt, penance for my crimes. But it wasn't until I reached my 30s that I started to hear the laughter, the chuckle amplifying with each horrid step. It's him. He knows I still have the star. It's Christmas Eve, and I honestly do not want to fall asleep. I think tonight is the night. I fear when I close my eyes and cautiously fall into the land of slumber that those abysmal words will slowly creep its way into my dreams. Because he was right. I was a naughty
boy.